Thanks for joining us today for this program called Beyond the Bench, Building a Startup with Small Business Grants. My name is Bhavana Mohanraj, and I'm the Assistant Director at PCI Ventures. I wanted to call this program Beyond the Bench because one of the phrases that we often hear in the life sciences is from bench to bedside. And so more broadly, even outside the life sciences, there's often this question of how do you take a technology out of a lab and turn it into a commercial product? And today we'll talk about how federal funding can help you get there. By way of my brief background, I did my PhD at Penn in bioengineering with Rod Mock and George Dodge, working on cartilage tissue engineering projects, including models of disease and therapeutic delivery. I then transitioned into the director of R&D role at a small startup called BioRes, developing regenerative implants for tendon and ligament healing. As the first employee there, I wore a lot of hats in a startup, including writing grants to the federal government, and hopefully we can provide you some tips and tricks to have a successful proposal. I then returned to PCIV as one of the portfolio managers for the life sciences companies, and I'm really excited to be working with a number of exciting founders and scientists and clinicians and researchers all at Penn. So here's an initial overview of the process to create a new venture. This is a simplified model, but I think it covers some of the key components of this process. And it really all starts with your invention. So at Penn, you may have already spoken with your licensing officer, which are colleagues in the Penn Center for Innovation. You may have a utility patent or a provisional filed. And that's really the core of this commercial product that you're hoping to build. You start your company, you start to build your team. You may recruit outside of your scientists and your scientific group, business advisors, strategic advisors. You're trying to really create the team that can execute on creating a product from this initial founding technology. You also start to talk about your strategy. So what does the commercial landscape look like? How does your product differentiate from others that are already out there on the market? And then you also have to figure out, how are you going to fund this? Where is your capital coming from to be able to support all of these activities and let you run your business? So within this entire framework, you might be asking, where does product development fit in? And the answer is it fits in all of these places. And this process starts really with basic research, your research grants that come in through the university, your R01s, your R21s, that let you discover, explore, test hypotheses. And once you have a compound that could potentially be a therapeutic, you have a mechanism that may be the foundation for a new device or a diagnostic, that's where you may think, okay, how do I now take this and translate this into a product? And your company can pick up the thread from there. So your company now works through proof of concept, R&D, scale up and manufacturing, and eventually sales and distribution. And so there are a number of ways you can support this financially. And the one we're talking about today is America's Seed Fund. So that's what the federal government calls their SBIR and STTR programs. Their intent is to encourage and support startups that have technologies that have the potential for commercialization. So if you have an idea you want to test, if you have a product you think is feasible, even if you're looking at licensing this technology and product down the road, this option leaves all those doors open for you to explore how to best commercialize your product. In parallel, there are, of course, other funding sources such as investors, including angels, venture capitalists, and at later stages, strategic partners who can help you get through the commercial phases. SBIR and STTR funding is particularly valuable because it provides resources that are free. So this is non-dilutive capital. It doesn't change your ownership in the company in any way. It just gives you some capital to be able to test the feasibility of your product and demonstrate that it works the way you intend it to. And this type of validation can be really valuable to kicking off conversations with investors who may want to see specific data before they're willing to commit their time and money as well. To help you through this process, our team, PCI Ventures, works with scientists and founders from Penn to start the company itself and then work through all of these other phases into commercialization. And towards the end of the presentation, I'll share more information on the resources we provide entrepreneurs. So how much money is out there for these companies? There is quite a bit. So today I'm going to focus on the NIH and NSF, but there are 9 other government agencies that also have small business funding available. The NIH in particular has a $1.2 billion budget, and their focus is entirely on therapeutics and technologies that have an impact on human health. The NIH, in comparison, has $180 million, and their focus is different. Their focus is on highly risky and highly innovative technologies. That's really what their focus is in comparison to the NIH. Within the scope of small business funding, there are 2 different mechanisms. The SBIR, which is the Small Business Innovation Research Grant, and the STTR, which is the Small Business Technology Transfer Research Grant. It's important to note for both of these cases, or both of these programs, the award is always made to the company. So the award or the proposal is submitted by the company, and then the award is received by the company. So even if there are sub-awards, all of that lives and is distributed from the company side. There are 3 different categories that distinguish these 2 programs. The first is partnering, second is budget allocation, and the last is the principal investigator. So for the SBIR, partnering is optional. The company can choose to do all of the work internally itself, or it can partner with universities, consultants, or contract manufacturers, just as examples, to do the work needed in the proposal. The company has to perform at least 67% of the work, meaning it has to spend at least 67% of the budget, and the principal investigator has to be primarily employed at the company. In comparison, the STTR requires a nonprofit research institution partner. So this, for example, could be Penn, it could be other universities as well. You have the option to partner with other third parties, such as consultants or manufacturers. And for the budget, the company has to perform at least 40% of the work, and the university at least 30% of the work. The remainder can be done by either institution or organization. It's completely up to you and what your strategy is to get the work done. The PI can also be employed by either the university or the company. We'll talk a little bit more about the budget and PI in a few slides, but the key takeaways here are that these 2 categories are defined by where the work is being done and who is leading the team. And so that is what determines if you are an SBIR or STTR, in addition to the partnering piece. I'll just mention here that I meant to at the beginning, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. Jamie is going to help moderate those, so throughout the presentation, please don't hesitate to hop in. In terms of types of awards, if you've decided you're going to go after this type of funding mechanism, the next step is to understand the type of awards and the amounts that are available for these projects. So a phase 1 proposal is all about demonstrating the feasibility of the product. It's proof of concept studies that show your technology works the way you intend it to, and it could be turned into a commercial product. A phase 2 proposal is about the transition to full research and development. So you're no longer doing initial proof of concept studies. You're now optimizing your product, its function. Maybe you're performing some verification and validation testing. One of the common questions that's asked is, what kind of data do you need to apply to each phase? And for a phase 1, you don't need any preliminary data. You can use published data to show scientific merit. And of course, if you do have preliminary data, for example, from a R01 or R21 or other pilot academic grants, you can use that to strengthen your proposal. For phase 2, you absolutely need the preliminary data because you've already gone past that phase 1 feasibility stage. And that can include an initial prototype, some initial in vivo data for a therapeutic, just as examples. In addition to the phase 2 and phase 1 mechanisms here, there are a couple others. One is called Fast Track, and the other is called Direct to Phase 2, and these are only available through the NIH. So Fast Track is where you actually apply for both your phase 1 and phase 2 together, and Direct to Phase 2 is where you skip phase 1 entirely, and you demonstrate in your proposal you've already collected all of your feasibility data, so you want to go straight into full R&D with phase 2. The other pieces that are important to note here are that the NIH and NSF are different in the way that they approach clinical trials, and that the NSF doesn't allow it, and the NIH does. And so I want to point out here that you can apply to multiple agencies at the same time. I think it's actually really important for a company to create a grant strategy, because you're thinking about what the future needs of the company are, and you can actually maximize your federal funding by leveraging multiple proposals and awards. So for example, if you have a device, a medical device, you could apply to the NSF to develop the technology and further refine it, and apply to the NIH to do an initial clinical pilot study. So it's a good way to be able to plan ahead. And if all of these grants land, you're not going to be trying to figure out which agency is going to fund you, because agencies won't fund repetitive work. I see a few questions in the chat, so I might just pause right here.
Yes, there are a couple of questions, Bob. The first question is university indirect costs on top of that amount, or that is the total costs and the IDC have to come out of that?
It's the total cost. So for we'll get into the budget a little bit in a little bit more detail, but the indirects for the university are built into the sub-award and then are part of the entire award that gets awarded to the company. One good question though, a good question that points out that for the NIH, you can exceed these numbers here. So they have a waiver to exceed this budget for most topics. So you can actually reach out to a program officer to talk about, you know, if you need $400,000, is that something that is possible through that particular institute?
Great. We also have a question from Elizabeth. How do most academic PIs fund the company formation? The out-of-pocket costs appear to be initially $1,000, but ultimately close to $10K for company to become operational.
That's a great question. And we'll talk a little bit more about our services at PCIV in terms of the company formation piece. But we have 2 company formation programs at Penn for Penn founders and faculty, called Upstart and Up Advisors. And we can actually work with you to go through the company formation logistics and make sure you get up and operational with our help.
And the final question right now from Ariel, for the NSF, can it be consumer tech and media, or does it have to be research, academic, B2B type of tech?
That's a good question. So on the NSF site, they have a number of subtopic areas that they're interested in. It can include consumer tech, but you'll want to look at the solicitation to make sure you're finding the right fit for the technology and the product. So if you've decided to apply, you should be aware of the timeline. The application process takes about a year from when you start putting pen to paper to when you have money in your bank account. And so as you craft this grant, you're really thinking about the future needs, as I said before, and where it could be in 9 months to a year. So this process differs slightly from agency to agency, but generally about 3 months before your submission date, you want to get your company registered and you want to start to draft your aims. Once you've drafted your aims, you can reach out to the program officers or program directors, particularly at the NIH and NSF, to ask them for feedback. And we'll talk a little bit more about this because they can be your biggest advocate and internal insight into what the reviewers are looking for in good proposals. You also want to determine who's going to be on your team for this proposal and how you build your budget. Once you've submitted your grant, it takes about 7 to 9 additional months for the proposal to go through review and for the company to receive its funds. And I'm going to pause here for a second to talk about 2 really great resources that you already have at Penn to help you work through this process. So the first is the team itself, creating the company. So small businesses are obviously founded on really innovative and great science. And this is a really prime opportunity for faculty and trainees to collaborate if they're interested in entrepreneurship. So these grants can be written in advance of a trainee graduating or completing a program. So you might want to think about starting to write these about a year before a trainee's program ends. The trainee can actually support a salary from one of these proposals or grants and make the transition into a PI role, into a leadership role at the company when it's awarded. So it's really an interesting opportunity to be able to leverage all of this expertise that exists in the lab to start to create a commercial product and make that transition. The other resource here is PCI Ventures. And so, as I mentioned, we have 2 company formation programs, Upstart and Up Advisors, that can help you create the company, build the team, develop the strategy, determine what your product development milestones are, and fundraise. Our SBIR and STTR focused program is called UPtheOdds, and we work closely with our companies to create competitive grants. So if you've decided to apply, now what goes in it? In terms of key components, it's still very similar to academic grants in that you're evaluated on significance, innovation, and approach, but the focus is really on the product and commercialization. So in these 2 buckets of significance and innovation, you're thinking about what's the commercial opportunity and the social impact. How are you changing a treatment paradigm? This might be particularly relevant to the life sciences companies. For innovation, what are the competitive advantages that you have against other technologies out there? And all of this feeds into articulating the commercial opportunity within the grant, which talks about your value proposition. So what need are you addressing, or what's the problem you're addressing? What are the benefits of your product, and why do those benefits matter? Other components also include assessing the market size and landscape, defining your customer needs. So have you talked to your potential customers to understand that what you want, what you're building is what they need and not just a nice to have? What the competitive landscape is. So are you thinking about who's already a player in the market? How can you differentiate your technology to show that it addresses a need better or in a different way? And then the other 3 items on here are also equally important. So your team is really determines how qualified and experienced you are to be able to execute on this project. You probably should think about IP protection as well. So we talked a little bit about talking with your licensing officer at PCI to be able to disclose new technologies. Beyond that point, you may want to do a freedom to operate search to know that you're not infringing on other products that are already out there. And then lastly, the product development milestones and financing plan are important even in the context of a proposal to the NIH, which is just for this initial piece of the product development pipeline, because they want to see that you've thought this through. So have you thought through, do you need regulatory approval? Have you thought about your clinical plan? Have you thought about what your manufacturing could look like down the line? And what's the capital needs the company has to be able to obtain to fund that entire process? Jamie, are there any questions?
Just one, just to clarify, yes, we will be sharing this PowerPoint with all of you as well as a few resources.
Awesome. All right, we're motoring through, but this is the bulk of your proposal at this point. So the approach is your focus on the product and how are you going to show feasibility. And in particular, I want to talk about phase 1 proposals today, because at least for the NIH, 74% of the awards are phase 1 awards. So in a phase 1 award, again, we're not talking about discovery or exploratory proposals. We're really talking about what experiments and data do you need to collect to show that the technology works and the product is feasible. And this is reflected in your aims in the way that they're structured. So they're very quantitative aims, or they should be quantitative aims, with defined success and failure criteria. You need to be able to support the approach with rigorous prior research. It's often a ding against the proposal when there's not enough literature and previous science cited within the proposal. The proposal also needs to have a realistic scope of work. So this is particularly important because you have about $250,000 for a phase 1, maybe a little bit more. And so what can you actually do with that money to be able to show value in the technology you're creating and the potential end product. You also need sufficient detail on the methods. So the reviewer needs to be able to follow how many animals maybe you have in a study, how many samples, what are the methods being used, to be able to show them that you have a rigorous research plan. And then lastly, acknowledge the pitfalls and alternative approaches. And this in particular is important for the NSF because the NSF funds highly risky, highly innovative projects. And so they expect there will be some failures within the course of this work. And it's important to be able to acknowledge and show that you have reasonable alternatives to navigate around those challenges. Sure.
There's a question. Ricardo asked this, I think it might have been about the previous slide. Will we need all of these already in a phase 1 NIH SBIR?
I'm going to go back one. So all of this should be talked about in a phase 1, but not necessarily in detail. And it also depends on the agency. So for the NIH, just by example, you have 6 pages to go through your research approach and strategy, including your significance and innovation. In the NSF proposal, which I believe is about 15 pages, you have to spend a lot more space on describing your commercialization approach in detail. The last thing I wanted to point out on this page is the importance of talking to the program officer, which I had mentioned before. So they have realistic expectations of what can be accomplished in the time frame of the grant and the funding amount, and can help make sure you don't overpromise and fail to deliver, which can cost you a phase 2 submission. So you want to reach out and give them background on your project, a specific aims page or a project pitch, and ask if they think you're ready and if they have feedback for you on the general scope of the project. You want to talk to them at least a few months in advance of the submission deadline, because the month before everyone is asking for their attention. And the goal here is really to have the PO say they think this sounds like a good proposal and you're ready to submit. To help make this a little more concrete, I wanted to pull some example aims, just more generalized here. But the NIH in particular shares examples of successful projects and also shares some of their summary statements as well. So you can look at both what was proposed and the feedback that the teams received. I broke this down into 3 categories. So the diagnostic, device, and drug technologies. On the left, for a diagnostic, we often think about build it and test it as the primary focus of a phase 1 proposal. So this example is a diagnostic panel for infectious agents. In their first aim, they developed the assay measuring sensitivity and specificity. In the second aim, they look to optimize parameters of the assay and quantifying that impact on performance, for example, the limit of detection in the assay, and then testing the assay with clinical samples. For the device category in the middle, again, it takes a build it and test it approach. This one is a device for agitation monitoring from the National Institute of Aging. The first aim looked at engineering the system, so developing and writing the firmware and building the algorithm. The second aim looked at testing usability, so evaluating the device on patients, comparing it to the standard of care. And the last aim looked at validation, so how does the data they're getting from the device compare to the standard of care assessment? And finally, on the right-hand side, for therapeutics, we're looking at safety and efficacy. And this example from the National Cancer Institute looked at a combination treatment for HPV-associated malignancies. So the first aim looked at toxicity, identifying the maximum tolerated dose and the optimum dose, as well as the efficacy in an animal model with some quantitative outputs. In tandem with crafting your approach, you will also need a budget that clearly states where the work is being done and by who. So there are 2 pieces here that I'm showing as an example. The award that goes to the company, which is the total award, and then the sub-award that in this example goes to the university. And these are some of the major costs that you would want to consider in this type of proposal. So the first, and I think one of the biggest costs, is your personnel. So for a new company, say you're pulling a graduate student or a postdoc into a new company, you can fund their salary through this proposal. You can fund part-time or full-time technicians or engineers. Obviously, you have some materials and supply costs, consultants. So we'll talk a little bit more about the team aspect on the next slide. If the company wants to rent space, if they need their own bench or office, you can include facility rental fees. And you can also include user fees for specialized equipment. For example, if you wanted to use the Sing Center. In terms of indirect costs, this was a question earlier. So the indirect costs for the university are built into the subaward, and then that total amount is in the total company award. And then the company itself can have its own indirect cost rate and a fee line, which for companies lets you spend that money on anything. So that's an important parameter to maximize as well. How the money is divided up really impacts if you are an STTR or SBIR, and our team actually has some templates that can help you work through this process through our UPtheOdds program. The goal here is really to be clear about expectations and costs, so your award can appropriately fund the work you're proposing.
Bhavana, there is a question from Elizabeth, which, Elizabeth, do you just want to unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, sorry. It was related to the 2 slides ago. With these, with these examples, do you ever see target validation as an approach? So there's not necessarily an existing drug, but there is an existing target and a tool compound. Have you seen that? And is it successful, or do you think we really need to have a drug?
No, I think that's another approach. So I pulled 3 examples sort of at random from the institutes, but if you look on the National Cancer Institute site, I do believe they have examples of that particular type of proposal.
Thank you.
Great. So now you've got your budget and you've got your approach, and the last couple of pieces are your team. So around your scientific founders are a group of people who are really going to help you get your product to commercial launch. And so these are just examples, and it will vary depending on what your team and your proposal needs, but there can be technical advisors. So if you don't have experience in product development and third-party logistics or other areas of manufacturing, they could be added to your team. Key opinion leaders can help you understand what data maybe your end users need to see in order to be convinced to use your product or believe that your product works. Regulatory consultants can obviously help you go through the FDA and navigate that process, help you figure out if you're a 510K or a PMA. Strategic advisors and business development experts are also an important piece of the pie. And so for these proposals, these are small business grants. And so there's, again, really want to see this focus on product development and commercialization. And a piece of this is understanding the market, the opportunity, the costs, and the financial projections of what this company could look like. And so you can include in your budget money for consultants in all of these categories. You still want to be compliant with the allocations of the budget. So 67% of the work being done by the company for an SBIR, at least 40% for an STTR, but they can be really valuable resources to show the reviewers you have a solid team that's thinking about everything in addition to the science. So the team does not also have to assemble until the time of award. So the goal here in this initial proposal preparation phase is to be able to figure out who you would be able to engage if the money comes through. At PCIV, we're also a resource for our companies and can help round out that business development experience. And lastly, you can reach out to your program officers because sometimes they can recommend scientific or clinical experts that can help you build the team. And the last piece of the application that I think is important and is sometimes overlooked are the letters of support. So these letters are important because they provide external validation to your reviewers about your customer needs. So you can actually have letters from your customers articulating how your product solves their problems and meets their needs, from collaborators to demonstrate their team commitment and showcase the expertise that the project needs to be able to execute. Corporate partners can also describe the strategic fit of your product with their pipeline or with their goals. And lastly, investors can also write a letter and demonstrate interest from external partners or external funding sources that will eventually be required for commercialization. And so there are some investors that may be willing to match small business grant funding if it's awarded, or they can tell you what data they would want to see in order to be convinced this is the right investment opportunity for them. So you can have these conversations and ask for feedback from investors to be able to more carefully craft your aims and get the data you'll want them to see. It can take some time to get these letters, so you want to start early again so that you have the best, you're making the best case to the reviewers possible. So back to the beginning. So we've covered quite a bit of information about the two different small business grant programs and what goes into the proposal. But as the question came up earlier, how do you start a company? What resources are available to you? So PCI Ventures provides support to entrepreneurs in a variety of different ways, including our two company formation programs, Upstart and UpAdvisors. So Upstart is our virtual incubator for companies with hands-on business development support from our team. And that includes executive recruitment. So we can help you find a CEO. We can help you find advisors to round out that strategy and business development experience. We can help you with operations and with fundraising. And in particular for the SBIR and STTR process, our UPtheOdds program works with our Upstart companies to complete the registrations on the company's behalf. We can help you structure the aims and review the proposal in detail. And at the end, we submit it on behalf of the company. For UpAdvisors, we provide additional support to independently operating companies that have access to our resources, programs, and network. Our UPtheOdds offering is that our team actually helps guide you through the registration process, but doesn't do it on the company's behalf. And we're happy to discuss your strategy and help you with the submission during our office hours. In addition, for Pennovation Works members, which is where our team lives, we are happy to provide access to our mentors and residents in our network. And again, similar to UpAdvisors, we can help you with your proposal and submission during our office hours. There are also a number of resources within Penn that are amazing for entrepreneurs outside of PCIV. So Penn Health Tech is one program that provides pilot funding to medical device and health technologies. Wharton has the Venture Lab, which is a resource for the university, which has entrepreneurship classes and has some funding sources. The Wharton Snyder Center Venture Consulting Group, so SCVC, is a group of MBA and undergraduate consultants that can work on a variety of projects. And a number of companies in our portfolio have worked with their group on pricing models, financial projections, market analysis, and they've been a really wonderful group to work with over the last few years. Similarly, the Detkin IP Clinic has also been a fantastic resource. They can work on projects including your general IP strategy, patentability, freedom to operate assessments. And so for that IP piece that's important to speak to in your proposal, you can get some additional detail and be able to provide that context by potentially working with their team and their students. Penn iCore is based on the NSF iCore curriculum and lets you test and validate startup ideas through customer discovery. So again, this talks to the impact of your product and your technology and making sure you're addressing customer needs. And then lastly, but not least, there's a number of great student groups on Penn's campus that I've listed here that can work on a variety of projects as well, including providing insight into the market, the commercial pathway, some new venture creation processes. So all in all, I'd say this is not a comprehensive list, but just an example of what's out there on Penn's campus to help you build a successful company. In addition, we have external resources pre and post award available through the NIH and NSF. And so for the NIH in particular, I want to highlight the Applicant Assistance Program. So this is a free program that takes 10 weeks to complete and walks your team through writing a proposal step by step. It's run by Eva Garland Consulting, and it's a well-known name for helping companies create competitive proposals and managing awards after they've been granted. In addition, there's the Innovation Partnership, or IPART programs for short, that can provide expertise and money towards writing and reviewing your proposal. And again, you need to engage with them ahead of time. And they actually have a webinar coming up on July 27th if you're interested in learning more about their offerings. And then I'll just touch on, for awardees, there's also another number of additional educational and funding resources. So the Technical and Business Assistance or TABA program is one that you can add on to as a supplement to your phase 1 or phase 2 proposal. For phase 1, it provides $6,500 per year, and for phase 2, I think it's $50,000. But these are things outside of the scope of the main proposal that you may need help with on the business side or technically. There's also the ICOR program and a concept to clinic commercializing innovation program. And I believe that's run by the NIBIB for medical devices as well. In terms of how likely you are to get an award if you submit, here are the statistics. So for the NIH and the NSF, phase 1 award rate is in between 10 to 12%. 11% of first-time submissions are awarded for the NIH, 18% for resubmissions. For phase 2 awards for the NIH, it's a 26% success rate. For the NSF, it's a little bit higher at 30 to 53%. I'll just make the note that for the NSF in particular, you get one shot at applying for a phase 2. So you spend a lot of time with your program officer at the end of your phase 1, making sure you've appropriately scoped out and developed your proposal to have the best chance at success, because you only get one try. For the NIH, you can have multiple resubmissions. PCI Ventures has been working on SBIR and STTR proposals for the last 10 years. And our UPtheOdds program has had companies bring in over $28 million in SBIR and STTR funding. And in FY20, 30% of the applications were awarded. So we're nearly double the national average, and at least for phase 1s. And we're particularly excited about working with so many exciting innovators and entrepreneurs that are coming with really exciting technologies to work with our team. And we think we can help you create competitive and compelling proposals. For our overall portfolio, we have 68 active companies as of 2020, and over $375 million has been raised by these companies from venture capitalists, angels, grants, and other funding sources. Over 24 million has gone back to Penn in research dollars, and we have 270 current team members across our portfolio and 5 exits. Our team is led by Michael Poisel, who is the executive director, and I work with Mike Dishowitz as well on the life sciences portfolio of companies. Jamie Sweet, who is here and been moderating the questions and helped set up this program, is the programming manager for the Penn Innovation Center. And Raquel Hiron is the administrative coordinator who helps all of our companies get started. So we're happy to talk with any and all of you about your ideas, about your interest in entrepreneurship, about your interest in writing grants for your small business. And every week we have office hours on Wednesdays. So please don't hesitate to reach out by email or to schedule time with us during our office hours, and we're happy to chat. And
we do have a couple more questions.
Perfect.
Another question from Ariel. For NSF phase 2, do you only get one try a lifetime or one try per amount of years?
So it's one try for the particular proposal you received a phase 1 for. You have an extended period, I think it's something like 37 months, it might be a little bit less, to be able to submit that phase 2. So you have enough time to really think about the structure and develop that proposal in detail. So I wouldn't rush it, but you do just get one shot.
And a question from Alan. How does writing SBIR, STTR grants to receive funding differ from trying to pitch to early stage incubators and accelerators or investors for funding? For instance, is there less need of differentiation compared to the market and is more science driven?
So for these grants, it does depend on the agency how much detail they want on the commercialization plan. But I would say this is a good maybe technical or founding document you could share with investors to be able to show here's what your plan is, or to further articulate your plan based off of this to create your pitch decks. I think the commercial opportunity is still really important to summarize in this document. And it's hard to do that for the NIH, it's 6 pages long. But you do want to make the effort because that's how they're evaluating your proposal. So just so you know, the reviewers for these proposals include both academic researchers and people from industry. So they're both looking for maybe slightly different things. Overall, the science has to be rigorous. And then you have the context of what is the commercial opportunity.
Oh, may I just ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, awesome. So I'm not necessarily like in the science field per se, like health or what other folks are, I'm assuming, mostly here for, but I am working on software. So we are building out like an alternative data lending algorithm. And part of it is we're experimenting with, one, what would it look like to be a lender? Then 2, what would it look like to build a smarter algo that doesn't use FICO or traditional credit score modeling? And I think initially we would try to separate out the 2, so that way in a case like we could potentially get a grant like this. But I was curious, are there any agencies that either work with like minority or women founders or would prefer them, or like in our case, part of the reason, the motivation behind our venture is that we want to democratize the access to capital. So we're specifically working with minority, Black, women-owned enterprises. Are you aware of like any like organizations or within like the NSF, whether there are certain prompts that we could potentially go after?
That's a good question. So NSF is open to any type of technology. So I talk a lot about the life sciences in these particular examples, but take a look at their topic areas because you may find one that's a good fit for this particular area. But even outside the NSF, there are 9 other agencies that fund small businesses. So you may find it a better fit in others. I was just trying to see if Department of Commerce actually has a small business program. The other piece of it is that there is a diversity and inclusion supplement that's out there right now for these grants. So you can apply for that funding. I think it might be a good fit for you and for your project. I don't know exactly what the conditions are, but I'm happy to follow up and send you information if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you. And another question that just a quick one that I had was, would like given the timeline, we would probably like at least raise an initial like smaller round if like, let's say for instance, this doesn't take a year, it's a year-long process. Would we not be unable to get the grant dispersed, like were we to have other investors?
That's a great question. And that's not a piece of the eligibility criteria that I hadn't talked about yet. So for these companies to be eligible, you need to be 50%, at least 50% owned and controlled by US citizens or permanent residents in the US. And so even if you get an investor or investment into the company, you can still apply it as long as they themselves are more than 50% owned and controlled by US citizens or permanent residents. It kind of daisy chains for the eligibility. If you have institutional VCs, you can still apply as long as one of them doesn't own more than 50% of your company. If you're solely owned by a VC that owns more than 50% of your company, I do believe you're still eligible as long as the VC itself is more than 50% owned and controlled by US citizens or permanent residents. So you can see how that builds. But the eligibility criteria is also online.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all the info.
Yeah, happy to. Are there any other questions?
Just one thing. Could you also share that diversity information with me as well?
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we'll conclude this program. But if you have any other questions in the future or would like to chat with any of our team, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always excited to have a new conversation.